one opinion religion or party to another, one opinion.
Good morning and welcome to Faith Family United Church of Christ Bible Study. We are in the middle of our series we're calling Bible Study 101, going through the Bible one book at a time, or we'll bunch a couple of them together here coming up when we go through some of the prophets because they're short and we can get through them quicker. But we're just hitting the highlights. We're not going too deep. We're just trying to get familiar with what's in each of the books. Today we're going to do Daniel. And so let's just go ahead and jump right in. There we go. So this is the Bible as we know it, at least the Old Testament. It has the books of the law, or the Torah. Then it has the historical books, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. And then it has the poetic books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs. And we are now into the prophetic books, and we have already did the major prophets down to Daniel. And today is the day we're going to do Daniel. Remember the major prophets and the 12 or the minor prophets. The reason why they call them major and minor is because the length, right. Lamentations is included into the major prophets in the Protestant book. Now I'm going to talk about the Hebrew book here in a minute. It kind of orders them all differently. So as you can see the timeline, 585 is when the southern kingdom, or the kingdom of Judah, was carried off to Babylon. Before that, the kingdom of the north, or which was Israel, was carried off to, earlier to by the Assyrians to Assyria, and then the Babylonians came, or the Chaldeans, as some of the Bibles say, took over and overthrew the Assyrians, and they came and took over Jerusalem and the temple. So that's where we see Daniel. Daniel starts out with as one of the people that was carried away. He was an educated person, probably of royalty or at least high social standing, and therefore he was chosen to be kind of an emissary to the people that they brought to Babylon. So just a reminder, the Chaldeans, that of course is the Babylonians, and here's the Asher, or Assyrians. The Assyrians first came down through here, and they took the north, and then later the Babylonians come and conquered the Assyrians, and they came down also. And of course they all went down and fought down here in Egypt as well. So, okay. There we go. And this is the breakdown of the Hebrew canon, or the Hebrew Bible. This is the order that they come in. You have the Torah, which is the same as us, the first 5 books. Then you have the prophets, the former prophets, and then the 12, or the former prophets, which was Judges, what we would call the historic books. They call the former prophets. In other words, they were prophets before there was actually prophecy. So all of these are basically stories, and in some of the stories there are prophets such as Elijah and Elijah and other prophets. You get to the prophets, the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then we don't see Daniel. But we go to the 12, and those are the minor prophets. We get Daniel over here in what's called the writings. That's because Daniel is a little bit different than the other prophets. In the first 6 chapters, it's all a story. It's a narration of Daniel and what he's done. And then later, from 7 to 12, we see his prophecies or his visions coming through. So they put Daniel right in the middle of the writings. And if you look at this, Solomon, Ruth is like one of the later books that there's a little bit of a timeline. We know it's after David, because Boaz is a descendant of David, and Boaz is who Ruth gets married to, I guess you could say. Anyway, so Ruth, Lamentations. Now we're talking about the fall of Jerusalem. Ecclesiastes. It's a book of wisdom. And then we have Esther, which is all about the Queen Esther, who saves the Israelites from destruction because they were going to be wiped out. That's where we get the Jewish people get the holiday of Purim, where they dress up and do crazy things, and they make fun of Malachi. I'm not sure. I can't remember his name. Huh? Anyway, so that's Esther, and then we have Daniel, which again is right in the heart of the Babylonian captivity. So, like I was saying earlier, Daniel is basically divided into two parts. The first part is 1 through 6, the story about Daniel and his friends. This is just basically a narrative about what they do and how they become so involved in the government. And then 7 through 12 is a series of revelations that Daniel sees, and then an angel helps him to interpret them or explains them to you. And I wanted to share this with you. I was reading Daniel, and I found this right here. All right, so I'll show it to the camera there. Hopefully you can see that. All right, do you know what this is? This is a ticket when I was in Iraq. I went through the ancient ruins of Babylon.
Ooh.
I had a professor who was basically disposed of his job and everything when he was, after the war had happened. But he was a professor at Baghdad University, and he gave us a tour of the ancient ruins of Babylon. That was nice. Anyway, that's just sentimental to me. Okay, so like Ezra, I think we've already talked about Ezra. Daniel is written partly in Aramaic and partly in Hebrew. So when you get the original writings in an original language, it was partly written in Aramaic, which is a kind of an off slang of Hebrew. A lot of the quotes in the New Testament where Jesus says something and they don't translate it, they just leave it as it is actually Aramaic. The word Abba, which is like saying daddy, that's Aramaic. Interesting, the Greek translation includes passages and whole stories that aren't in the Hebrew version. There's two, Bel and the Dragon and Susanna, and these are stories that they've added into the book of Daniel, the Greek version, when the Greeks wrote. You know, the whole Old Testament was translated into Greek, and so we have a Greek Old Testament that is called the Septuagint. So when we talk about the Hebrew writings, a lot of times we can point to the Greek and say, oh, it was translated into Greek as well. And what is interesting is in the Old Testament, when they wrote it in Hebrew, there's a gap of having it written and translated. Now, in 1000 AD, after Christ, they went back to the Old Testament and they started making the vowels because nobody knew how to pronounce a lot of the words. All the words are just consonants. So they went in, they did this pointing system. So they didn't have to touch the the words, they just put dots or dashes, and so that made it. Now what they've come to find out when they went and found all the scriptures in the Dead Sea Scrolls and I don't know how to say that, Nagagi, I think that's how you say it. But they found all these ancient scriptures, and they found the Greek, and the Greek Old Testaments actually are closer to the original than they originally thought. So they point to the Greek as, anyway, I'm rambling on, just trying to throw out more information that's needed. But anyway, know that in the Greek translations there are a couple stories that are added, and some verses that are added as well. 1 through 6, Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You don't know those people, do you? Because Nebuchadnezzar changed their name to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now do they sound familiar? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are friends of Daniel's, and like Daniel, they were probably wealthy too. They were intelligent, they could read, they can do different things, and so they were placed in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, or the Babylonians. Now, interesting, Daniel, which you see the Ah and the El and the Ah, those are obviously Hebrew names. El, of course, meaning God. So everybody gets a new name, which doesn't sound anything like their Hebrew name, but Belteshazzar. We never hear Daniel called that. Throughout, he's called Daniel. He keeps his Hebrew identity. Where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if I talked about Hannah, Mishael, and Azariah, you would go, who's that?
Got the song, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah, I know that song.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just thought that was interesting. The first story is about them eating. Okay, so they notice that these four are not eating the food that is put in for them. They call it the royal food. In other words, it's really rich. It's got, probably has pork and a lot of other meats in there that they don't want to eat. And they want to keep kosher. So they're like, okay, we're not going to eat this. And King Nebuchadnezzar says, no, you have to. And then Daniel speaks up and he says, I'll tell you what. You give us nothing but vegetables for the next, I can't remember how long it was, next month or so, and come back and see if we're not healthier than the people that eat the royal food. And that's exactly what happens. They look healthier and stronger than the people that ate the royal food. So that's the first story. I think that's a good take on becoming vegetarians. See how you can twist the Bible to say anything you really want it to say? It's sad that people do that. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar decrees that, the next story is Nebuchadnezzar decrees that everybody must bow down to this idol that he makes, and if you don't, then we're going to cut you off, throw you into the fiery furnace. Spoiler alert, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the furnace, they didn't die. As a matter of fact, they looked in there and they saw a fourth man. Oh, let me go back just a second. When they take them and they go to throw them in the furnace, King Nebuchadnezzar is so angry that someone would dare defy him. Sound like somebody we know? That he's going to teach them a lesson. And so not only does he get ready to throw them into the fire, he gets the fire stoked up so hot, it was 12 times hotter than normal. It was so hot that when they opened the door, the strongmen that went to throw them in, they died from the heat. So they throw the three men in, they shut the door, and then they notice something. They notice there's a fourth person there. And going back through the Old Testament, they conclude that this is an angel of the Lord. So the angel of the Lord, and then what happens? But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walk out of the furnace. And King Nebuchadnezzar is changed by this. He actually starts praising the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay? And that's kind of it for Nebuchadnezzar. Because later on we'll talk about, Nebuchadnezzar starts praising God. What we also have is Nebuchadnezzar asking Daniel to interpret his dreams. Now, there's a catch there. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't tell him the dream. Nebuchadnezzar says, no, you just tell me the dream. Now, he has all of his magi, or his wise men, come and do this. And they're like, how could we interpret a dream when we don't even know what the dream is? And he says, because I want to make sure that you truly are getting the message from above and you're not just making something up. And so he says, they say, we can't do that. And he's going to do away with the magi. Magi, remember those guys? They end up coming from the east, where Babylon is, to praise God, for praise Jesus at his birth. Okay, so Daniel steps in and he says, give me some time and I will interpret your dream. Lo and behold, it's told to Daniel, and he comes back and he tells the dream and what it means to Nebuchadnezzar. And so once again, Nebuchadnezzar is swayed to praise the God of Daniel. So that's basically what's in the first 6 chapters, the stories that are lead up. These are all narratives. And then we got to get into the final part of it is Nebuchadnezzar's son. Why did I not write down his name?
Belshazzar?
Yeah. I thought I put his name down there. Anyway. Let me read it so I can say it right.
Chapter 8.
And now marked up.
That's Belshazzar.
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 Yeah, Belshazzar. There it is. Belshazzar in chapter 5. He becomes the king after Nebuchadnezzar, and he decides he's going to throw a big banquet. And when the Babylonians came and they sacked Jerusalem, they went in the temple and they took all the plates and the cups and the utensils, all the stuff that the priests would use for their ceremonial stuff. And he decided, that would make a great setting for our banquet. And he used that. And during that, there's a hand that appears. And it writes on the wall. And what it writes is, Mene Tekel Parsin. And what does that mean? And they bring Daniel in. Daniel tells what it means. It basically means that you're going to be overthrown by the Medes and the Persians. So that's interesting. I don't know about you. You've heard the story about the writing on the wall, right? Who did you think it was directed towards? Nebuchadnezzar? I had always thought that until I read it. And I'm like, oh, that's not Nebuchadnezzar, that's his son, Belshazzar. So anyway, so it's his son. God writes on the wall, tells him, get ready, you're going to be overthrown. And that's basically leads us to chapter 6, which I got ahead of myself there. Chapter 6, which is Daniel in the lion's den. Now, Daniel in the lion's den happens after Belshazzar is deposed. He's deposed by Darius, king of the Medes, because the Medes come and take over the Babylonians. And he does the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar does, only his bowing down and worshiping their gods is symbolized by a playing of instruments. When you hear the instruments, you have to bow down and pray. Now, at this time, Daniel is already a bigwig in the royal courts. So when the Medes took over, he stayed there because he becomes valuable to them. As a matter of fact, he becomes second in command. And so what happens is they play the music and Daniel doesn't bow down. And so they run and they tell the king, hey, Daniel's not bowing down. And you got to do something about it. What do they call them? Karens. Pointing out that he didn't do what you told him to do. And so the decree goes out that he has to be thrown into the lion's den. And you think that Darius is like, I'll show him. But Darius isn't like that. Because as you read the story, he's made the decree. And because he's made the decree, it has to go through. And Daniel's put into the lion's den. And he stays there. And then Darius comes. And he stands at the door. And he hollers for Daniel. Daniel, are you still in there? And Daniel says yes. And Darius is happy to hear this. And he lets him out. And Darius praises the God of Daniel. So the Daniel in the lion den, once again, is about not bowing down to different idols. So 7 through 12, I'm not going to get into a lot of this because there's a lot of speculation and prophecies on what they mean and what they don't mean. But the point of these prophecies is basically what's going to happen to the people of Israel and Judah when they go back. He's already prophesied that the Medes and the Persians would come and take over, which they did. And now they're going to be sent home. So when they get home, he prophesies, and that's the prophecies between 7 and 12 about different things, like talks about the ruler of the south and the ruler of the north. Well, here in a second, we'll look at that when we look at a timeline of history and how they actually come to be, and it falls right in line with a lot of these prophecies. But the one prophecy I want to point out comes from 9:26, and it says, after 62 sevens, the anointed one. What is the anointed one? The Christ. As a matter of fact, that's what it means, or Messiah. That's what it means, the anointed one. So the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolation have been decreed. Okay, so what happens after Jesus is born or killed? Jesus is killed, 33, and then
a couple hundred years later,
in the 1970, in 70 AD, the Romans come in, completely destroy everything again.
Well, the Jews revolted.
Yeah, the Jews revolted again.
And they do it again.
again and again. So that's basically, that prophecy is directly at the Messiah and exactly what happened. Okay. So here is some good things, or good things. Here is a timeline of history and what is predicted in those prophecies and visions of Daniel. In 336 BC, this is BC, Alexander the Great comes from the west and basically overtakes the Persians. In 320, Judah is ruled by the Ptolemies. Egypt. Who's the most famous Ptolemy we know? Daughter. Cleopatra. Cleopatra. She was a Ptolemy. And so that's in the south. And it talks about the rulers in the south will come up again and they will rule Judea. And then later in 198, Judah conquered by the Seleucids. Now in our history, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and I can't even think of the third one, it just totally slipped me. But these were commanders of Alexander who got portions of the kingdom that Alexander once had. And so they split it up. And then they started fighting amongst themselves. And so the Seleucids, which was in the north, come down and conquer the Ptolemies and take over the region. About this time, Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanes, decides he's going to teach the Jews. He's going to tell them who's boss. He goes into the temple and he does unkosher things. He sacrifices a pig on the altar. Wow. That talk about desolation. That would be totally demoralizing. So in 175 to 176 BC again, there's a Hellenistic reform in Jerusalem. Basically what happens is they say, hey, we got to get back to our true religion. And so they do. And we have what is called the Maccabees revolt. And I wish that the Protestants would look at this more closely, because it tells the story that the gap between when the Jews come back to Jerusalem from captivity until Jesus is born. And that's kind of fills that gap, and understanding that there was this great revolt, and they end up rededicating the temple. They started their own rule again. Judah was controlled by Judah, or Israel. And then what happens in 64 to 63, Judah's independent under Hosmanus, a descendant of one of the Maccabees. And then 100 years later, they're conquered by the Romans, and General Pompey comes in and takes over. And guess what he does? He does basically the same thing that Antiochus Epiphanes. He desecrates the temple. So now we're at 63, so less than 100 years, and we're at the Christ. And all of this is foretold in Daniel. So here's one thing that I just want to leave this out there. I don't have an answer, but I want you to think about it yourselves. Is when Jesus talks about the end of the age, which if you read Daniel, it talks about that. The end is near. Is he talking about the fall of the nation of Israel, or is he talking about what we come to think of the end of time, when Jesus is going to come back? I would contend with the language that Jesus uses and the language that is used that he's talking about the end of Jerusalem in 70 AD, when the temple is destroyed for the last time. And most of the Jews are carried off. They call it the diaspora, the great diaspora, when they're carried off and sent all over the world. So, at the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. That sounds like the Romans taking over everything. And yet we want to make it about our coming future. What do you think? Go ahead.
I don't know. Could be the Greeks too.
Yeah.
They came in.
I think this particular part of the prophecy is after all of this had fallen, all of Israel had fallen, even though they went back and they've been dispersed. Because, I contend, because they didn't recognize the Messiah.
Well, Babylon, the Babylonian captivity and Daniel is in that time period.
Yes.
Which is prior to the Greek invasion.
Yeah, that's Alexander the Great.
That's right.
Mhm.
And the Macedonians coming in, so that's why I said it could be that too.
But this north and south, the Seleucids coming down and the Ptolemies coming up and fight. So, but prophecy is prophecy, and it's not always easy to interpret. So I like to do what they did in the New Testament. Be on the lookout, and know what's going on in your time. So that's all I have for today.
Thank you.
If you have any questions, let me know. We'll try to answer them. And we'll go back. Next week we're going to do three. We're doing Hosea,
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah. So Hosea, Joel, and Amos. So we'll do 3. All right, thanks.